Judge a man by his questions rather than his answers. Voltaire.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here, and today we begin to wrap up our discussion of the colonial era. By the turn of the 18th century, 13 British colonies were sprawling across 4 geographic regions along the eastern seaboard of North America. We've discussed the diverse peoples, religions, and economic systems that emerged there. We've seen the colonies up close. But now it's time to look at them in a broader context. As the British colonies grew, they began interacting with each other and with the rest of the world. And indeed, the world was rapidly changing. Prior to the age of colonization, the economic and cultural epicenter of the world was the Mediterranean. There, people from Europe, Africa, and Asia came together and exchanged goods and ideas. But with the introduction of the Americas, a new epicenter was created, one that connected the old world and the new. You've all likely heard of the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of crops, technology, and diseases across the hemispheres. You may also have heard of triangle trade, the economic patterns that defined the new Atlantic economy. But recent scholarship suggests that the effects of transatlantic exploration were far more complex. Historians point to the emergence of an Atlantic world, which witnessed the interaction and evolution of cultures and ideas across an ocean. The American colonists faced conditions and challenges that were unique to them. So while political, intellectual, and religious movements traveled from old world to new, they took on a life of their own in the colonies. We'll discuss 2 such movements today, the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. But first, let's ask a big question. Was there a single defining feature of the 13 British colonies? Okay, here's the thing. We all know where this story is going. The 13 colonies will band together, stand up to the British Empire, and live happily ever after. Or, sort of. But we spent weeks discussing how different the 13 colonies were. They featured different ethnic groups, different religious preferences, different economies, different social structures, different modes of thinking altogether. When it comes time to circle the wagons, or form a united country, what will they rally around? Was the desire for independence the only thing that united the colonies? Or was there something more beneath the surface? Let's dive into the Atlantic world and find out. Here's our first big idea. The Enlightenment began in Europe, but spread to the American colonies, where colonists debated ideas about religious freedom, the role of government, and man's natural rights. You probably remember from your world or European history class that the Enlightenment was a major intellectual movement that began in part as a backlash to centuries of religious wars in Europe. The philosophers of the Enlightenment challenged the prevailing religious constructs in Europe. They based their beliefs instead on reason and evidence. They debated the nature of human and natural rights, and they discussed responsibilities of government. These philosophers were well known in Europe, but they were read in the New World as well. As the American colonies developed, a transatlantic print culture tied England and the colonies together. Printers in the colonies would copy and distribute the works of the Enlightenment philosophers, and American thinkers would build on those ideas. You don't have to look hard to see the effects of the Enlightenment philosophers on the colonies. Just look at America's founding documents. Jean-Jacques Rousseau laid important groundwork for many Enlightenment philosophers, as well as America's founding fathers. He discussed government as a social contract, in which people must give up certain liberties in order to receive protection and security from their government. This idea was widely acknowledged in America, and after achieving independence, there would be much debate over that delicate balance between liberty and security. Voltaire gained notoriety in Europe for his beliefs on freedom of speech and the freedom of religion. Of course, these became pillars of the United States Constitution. Both are explicitly protected by the First Amendment. The Englishman John Locke was perhaps the most noteworthy Enlightenment thinker. He discussed the roles and responsibilities of government and what he believed to be the innate natural rights of man: life, liberty, and property. His work was essentially plagiarized in the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, our founding documents are rife with Enlightenment ideas borrowed from Europe. But the colonies had Enlightenment philosophers of their own, who built on the ideas of their European counterparts, and even put many into action. The foremost early colonial philosopher was Roger Williams, a Puritan settler in Massachusetts who spoke out vociferously in favor of the separation of church and state. After he was banished from Massachusetts, he founded Rhode Island as a place of true religious freedom. Later on, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams each earned notoriety in the 1700s for their enlightened positions that formed the ideological basis for the American independence movement. Enlightenment ideas were widespread in Europe and the colonies, but they were not universally embraced. Some felt that the secular emphasis of the movement would condemn society in the eyes of God. A backlash to the Enlightenment emerged in the early 1700s. It's outlined in our second big idea. The Great Awakening re-energized the Protestant traditions of the American colonies and laid important groundwork for the American independence movement. The Great Awakening refers to a massive wave of religion, in particular Protestant Christianity, that originated in Europe and took deep root in the colonies. In many ways, the Great Awakening was a direct response to the Enlightenment. Enlightenment philosophy de-emphasized the importance of religion. Most of the philosophers were deists. They believed in a divine creator of the universe, but did not believe God meddled in the everyday lives of man. Preachers of the Great Awakening warned that society had fallen out of touch with God. They railed against vanilla church services that were formulaic, mundane, and increasingly ill-attended. In an attempt to return colonial society to its Christian roots, preachers of the Awakening altered their tactics and their message. The Great Awakening was characterized by large outdoor revivals that brought religion outside of the church and into the town square, literally. Traveling preachers like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield toured the colonies, spreading their take on the Word of God. These preachers were standout orators who blurred the lines between spirituality and entertainment. They were the closest thing the colonies had to rock stars. People traveled many miles to hear them preach, and at one point, Whitefield was one of the most recognizable men in the American colonies. One of the reasons the Great Awakening preachers had such wide appeal was because they de-emphasized the role of denomination. They didn't ask their followers to become Puritan or Lutheran or Quaker or Anglican. They asked them only to be Christians. And they were clear on what they believed would happen if people failed to do so. In his most famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, Jonathan Edwards describes in grim detail the eternal damnation that await those who reject Christ. On the flip side, his promise of salvation and paradise was particularly inspirational to the poorer classes in the colonies, who struggled to find stability and joy in their lives. Beyond religion, the Great Awakening had other intellectual consequences in the American colonies. The de-emphasis in denomination inspired a new sense of individualism. The notion that one could have a personal relationship with God led to challenges of church authority, and more broadly, challenges of traditional authority in general. Some historians suggest that the seeds of the American Revolution were sowed by the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening also inspired questions about the morality of slavery. Many enslaved people converted to Christianity during the Awakening, leading to increased opposition to the institution, especially in the North. So it is true that when the American colonies were founded, their differences were far more apparent than their similarities. And indeed, many of those differences have endured for centuries. But the movements made possible by the print culture of the Atlantic world did break down some of the barriers between the colonies. The Enlightenment inspired colonists in all regions to consider the roles and responsibilities of their government, and to assert new notions of liberty and natural rights. The Great Awakening broke down denominational barriers that once separated the colonies, fostered a new sense of individualism, and challenged notions of authority. While their fundamental messages opposed one another, both movements united the original 13. They gave the colonies common ground and common interests, and both laid critical foundations upon which the American Revolutionary Movement will soon be built. Next time, we'll put a bow on the colonial era by discussing salutary neglect and the original democratic institutions of the American colonies. See you then.